Hi guys! This month most of you voted for a video tutorial about line work and inking, so here we are. I also realized it's a pretty appropriate topic with Inktober coming up, so I really hope it's going to be helpful and that maybe you will learn some new tips and tricks. So let's get started. I made this character last night that I'm going to use for the purpose of this tutorial. And first we're going to go over some basic things. The first one being canvas size. I usually use a canvas that is 3,000 or 4,000 pixels on the long side, and I crop it out a little so that it fits Instagram's pretentious canvas size ratio. In this case I have 4,000 by 4,000 pixels at 300 dpi. I like to use a bigger canvas when I'm drawing full body characters because, as you notice, the head of the character is a pretty small portion of the entire canvas, and when you zoom in to ink that, you don't really have a lot of pixels to add all the detail that you may want to. So I like to size up my canvas a little bit, and I also make sure that my character is as big as possible and almost hitting the size of the canvas because I don't want to waste any pixels. Now let's go over my process for designing this character because I think it's important for what we're going to be discussing today. The first step is to make this super rough sketch using a pretty thick low opacity brush. As you can tell, it's super rough. I just want to put down the silhouette idea that I have of this character and also roughly the pose. In the next step, I clean up my character, but I still keep it quite loose. I just want to figure out what the design is going to look like, but I don't go into any unnecessary details yet. And this is my final third sketch in which I actually make all the decisions that there are to be made. It's pretty clean, it's not perfect, but this is all the information that I need in order to proceed to the next step. So why am I showing you this? I think it's important that you make as many sketch passes as needed before you start inking. Because from my experience, it's much easier to ink something like this than it is to ink something like this. Because this is pretty rough and there are a lot of decisions to be made yet. For example, with the clothing folds on the sleeve here, you have all of these lines that you have repeated a couple of times and you're not really sure which one you're going to repeat when you start inking. So I think it's important that all of the design decisions are made at these stages, because when you start inking, you only have to think about the inking process. You shouldn't be making any design decisions when you're inking. So that's why I think it's important that you make all of those design decisions here in the sketch phases. This sketch is pretty clean, but still it's not perfect because you have areas like this one, or for example with the neck here, with the ear. But still, I have all of the information that I need in order to proceed to the next step. And also, another important tip is that you shouldn't be thinking about making your drawing pretty when you're sketching. I mean, in a way you are, but you shouldn't be thinking about pretty rendering is what I'm trying to say. Like, this is not pretty, but I don't care because I'm going to clean it up in the next step. And also another tip that I have for you, which applies not only to inking but to cleaning up your sketch as well. When you are making a new pass and you want to clean up your drawing, try to have your previous sketch layer on very low opacity, as low as you can go, because if you have the opacity something like this, like 70 or 50%, when you start cleaning up on top, you kind of depend a lot on the values that you already have underneath from the previous sketch, and then when you turn off the previous sketch, your clean drawing may not really look very good. So that's why I always try to lower the opacity as much as possible. Now let's talk about everyone's favorite topic, brushes. As you probably know, I use my inking brush, my own inking brush, which is the Tranquility brush, and it's available for all of you. If you don't know, you can go to my Patreon, and it has its own hashtag, so it will be easy for you to find it. What I like about this brush is that it has a really nice texture to it, but you can really use any other brush that you like. It doesn't really matter, and the tips that I'm going to share in this tutorial are not really related to this brush in particular. They're just inking tips in general. When it comes to having clean, smooth lines, there is the streamline option here in Procreate, which I usually hate it pisses me off for some reason and I always have it off, but in some cases I will use about between 1 and 3% of streamline, which you can't really feel, but it just removes some of the natural jitter of your lines. But as I said, most of the time I don't use it. Now I'm going to start inking this character and I'm going to share some tips as we go. Also, a little disclaimer is that I usually hold my pencil like this, and it kind of hides what I'm doing, which is also why I usually don't do the top-down shots when I'm making videos. But this time I'm going to try and hold it kind of like this so you can actually see what I'm doing. So when you're doing line work, you have two options. You can either do big swooping lines like this if you want to have super clean line work, but this is not how I usually do it because it just looks too clean for my liking. What I usually try to do is I have a combination between the big strokes and doing slow controlled lines where I'm pushing very lightly in some areas and then more on other areas. So in the end it looks a little bit rawer, but I personally really like that. And also occasionally I will repeat a line twice, and I don't really care about it looking perfectly clean because this is just the look that I like. But again, this is more about personal preference and style. Another tip that I have for you is to use the same brush for your eraser as you do for your brush tool. Because if, for example, you're using this very soft pencil for the eraser, you kind of get something like this, which I think looks weird. So instead, try to use the same hard-edged brush that you have for your actual brush tool. And if you're wondering how I'm switching between tools so quickly by swiping up and down, you can go back to my Patreon page and watch my tutorial on how I use Procreate. Sometimes when I have two lines that are crossing like this, I prefer to cross them and then erase the excess. I think it looks much more natural than trying to make the two lines meet. Let's talk a little bit about line thickness. There are some rules that I try to follow when it comes to that. So for example, wherever I have hard edges or protruding bones, I will try to make my line thicker there, like here at the shoulder. I also try to make my line thicker at corners. I do the same here with the sweater. You can also use a thicker line to emphasize weight. So usually at the top of a volume I will use a thin line, and at the bottom I will use a thicker line, because this indicates that the object is weighing down and it's being pulled down by gravity. You can also use thicker outlines to separate two objects, like for example here with the sleeve. I made its line a little bit thicker to indicate that it's in front of the skirt and the other part of the sweater. If you want to indicate that two objects are touching, you should usually make the line between them a little bit thinner. As for example here, I imagine that this part of the sleeve is touching the rest of the sweater behind, so I'm drawing the line a little bit thinner, but then as it goes down, it gets thicker because I imagine that her arm is coming forward just a little bit. Here is a more accurate but a little bit weird example. Imagine that someone threw these two balloons and they are touching in the air. If you make this very thick line between them, it doesn't really show that they are touching. But if you make it as thin as possible or even erase it in some places, I think it really gives the sense that there is contact between the two objects. So this is a weird example, but if you try to apply it to more complex scenarios, it works very well. And usually when I start inking the face, I slightly lower the size of my brush. I'm making the line on the cheekbone a little bit thicker because I want to indicate that there is actual bone there and a hard surface, while the cheek has a very thin line in comparison because it's a very soft and fleshy material. You can also use your line work to show light and shadow, as I have here under the neck this very thick black shadow, and I also make some of my lines thinner on the top planes of things. So for example here at the shoulder, this line is thinner than this one because I imagine that there is light coming from this direction, and the same goes for the sleeve and this part of it as well. If you want to show that there is a very strong light coming from a certain direction, you can even erase some of the lines that are on the side of that direction, in this case the top lanes of things. And don't feel the need to connect all of your lines. You can leave some blank spaces like I do with the eyes. You don't need to connect the two corners. You can, but as you can see, that kind of gives the feeling that she is wearing black eyeliner. So it's okay to leave lines that are not connected, because this is actually how our brains work. If you draw this, your brain knows that this is a circle and it will connect the two lines in your head. So you can actually use this to your advantage, because it makes your drawings a little bit more interesting, because it leaves something to the viewer's imagination. When you're inking your character's face, try not to go overboard with the details, because after all, the head of the character is a pretty small portion of the drawing, and if you draw all of these details that you would normally do if you were making a portrait, when you zoom out, it's going to look very weird, because you will have like all of this detail here and all of the simplicity for the rest of the design. So I try to keep a balance between the two. I know it's very tempting to draw all the individual eyelashes and wispy hairs and all of that. You can do it, but try to be careful and often zoom out to see how the head looks compared to the rest of the body. For example, I usually like to draw these very detailed noses that have a very distinct structure, but in this case I think I'm going to keep it very simple, because when you zoom out, if I draw all of the different details, the nostrils, the line, and all of that, it kind of looks too busy, so I don't need all of that here. Maybe just a little line to indicate the bottom plane of the nose is enough. You can get away with 1 or 2 lines maybe. I mean, that really depends on the style also and the level of simplicity, but in this case I think that's plenty. And I'm actually going to take a little break from inking the face and the head, because I don't want to get too carried away with the details and everything. And this is valid for your drawing process in general, not just for the inking part. Try to not work on one area until you finish it sometimes, but take little breaks from it and then come back to it a little bit later, because you will often see some mistakes that you made and you will be able to fix them. I don't want the line of the leg, this one, to be too thick, because it's a pretty straight line and it's going to draw too much attention, so I'm going to keep it fairly thin and light. And I'm using a bit of a thicker line for the calf muscle here, because there is a change in direction of the line, and also I'm trying to indicate a bit of a shadow there. making my line a little bit thicker in this area because there is sort of a corner there, and I also imagine that there is a lot of fabric scrunched up here from the shoes. It's obviously very stylized, but still I am keeping that thing in mind, so I want to sort of indicate it without actually drawing all the fabric. So my way of doing this is using a slightly thicker line. I mentioned this in pretty much all of my videos, but I am not going to add too much details to the shoes because I don't want to distract from the most important thing, which is her face and, you know, her head. Because when we look at a drawing or a person in general, we tend to look at their faces first, and this is a good thing, so I want to strengthen that, and I don't want to take the viewer's attention away from her face with her shoes, because they are not important in this drawing. There is nothing about the story that is important here about the shoes. I'm also adding little shadows in areas like these two, where I imagine that if the light is coming from above, then a little shadow will form here because the sleeve is also touching the sweater and it's preventing the light from hitting this side of it, and the same goes for the sleeve as well. Now when I'm drawing the hair, and if there are any hair accessories as well, I actually like to create a new layer and draw them on top, because if I need to erase anything, I don't want to mess up with the face that I already have designed and inked. Another thing that you can show with your line weight is atmosphere, and this is actually more valid if you're doing background work, I think, but it can also be applied in character design. For example, with the beanie here, I have these thicker lines in the front part of her head, but as the beanie is going back in space, the lines are getting a little bit thinner because there is atmosphere. Obviously, this is a little bit stretched here because the beanie, the top of the beanie is not that far from the face, so there will not be that much atmosphere in between, but I'm just trying to show you the principle. So if you're doing any background work, if you're drawing any buildings, the ones that are closer to the camera will have thicker outlines, and the ones that are going away from the camera and further in space, they will have thinner and thinner outlines because there is air in between, so there is less contrast. If you've ever done background studies, you will probably have noticed this. And if you imagine some mountains that you've ever seen in real life, you may remember that the mountains that are very, very far away are very light and almost blending in with the sky. And this is because of atmosphere. So when you're doing line work, you can take that principle and sort of exaggerate it. Another thing that you can use your line work for is to show materials and fabrics. So in this case, I want to make the sweater fluffy, but I'm not going to paint the image, so I don't have the luxury of using all the different colors and brushes to show the texture. So what I can actually do is I can make these little lines on the sweater to show its texture. I don't have to draw them everywhere, just a few spots are enough, because as we discussed, the viewer's brain will kind of connect the dots, see a few of those lines and be like, oh, okay, so this is a fluffy sweater. So you don't have to actually draw them everywhere all over the place because it's going to look very busy. This is one texture that you can show, but there are so many options. You have these sweaters that, you can see the knitting pattern of, so you can actually do that. It's maybe a little bit trickier in this case because we have a lot of clothing folds, so you have to actually think about the volume of the clothing, and especially with such stylized pieces, it's sometimes tricky, but this is also something that you have to think about how to stylize and simplify. Yeah, something like that, and then you continue and do it on the entire sweater. I'm not going to do it because I like the fluffy one better, but this is just how it works. As I said, it's a little bit trickier with the folds though, so you have to kind of see what works best. If you want your style to be a little bit more flat and cartoony, you can actually disregard the clothing folds and just draw straight lines on top of them. I don't think that works very well in my style because I try to show the structure and volumes and follow them with whatever I am drawing on top. When you're inking your characters, don't be afraid to use white lines too. For example, if you have this big black shape and you want to show some details inside, I imagine that this is a strap of a little purse. So maybe it has these little holes like a belt would, and then a little buckle. Try to use negative spaces as much as you use black outlines and silhouettes and shapes. My only advice for these things is to try and keep them as simple as possible because you don't want to draw this super detailed belt that is standing out way too much on your character. Now I'm looking at my design and thinking about how can I make this a little bit better. Are there any places where I can make the line thinner or thicker to emphasize what is happening there? And the first thing that stands out to me is this area right here. If I zoom out, it's a little bit confusing. So I think I want to make some of the lines a little bit thicker there to indicate that some of the volumes are in front of other volumes. In this case, this part of the sweater here is in front of the sleeve there. I think this is much more readable now. I made this line the thickest here because I also think it's going to have some shadow there because the light is coming from above. I'm not going to be adding any shadows here because it's going to be too busy. I don't want the viewer to look at this sleeve here because it's in the back and it's really not an important detail in this case. You can also use thicker lines to separate your character from the background. This is especially useful if you place your character in an environment and they are not just standing on a blank canvas. But it's also something I have seen a lot of artists do in their styles. So you just make the outline of your character a little bit thicker than what's inside. So this is roughly what I mean. It's obviously quite loose and not precise at all, but in general this is the principle. If you try to imagine the entire character like that, because I don't want to do it. It's just a stylistic choice. I personally don't really like to do it because it takes away from the line weight that I worked so hard to achieve. But I've seen a lot of artists do it and it looks very, very nice in their styles. So let's talk a little bit about line quality. As we discussed, one way to do things is to make big swooping lines and then repeat them as many times as needed. You've probably noticed that I repeat lines many times until I get them right. And I'm not afraid to hit and do like 30 times if I need to. I just need to get the perfect line. If you use this technique, I think you can get very good line quality, very smooth. Or if you prefer, you can do it like this, as we already discussed, where you just go slowly and in the end you will have this slightly jittered lines, which is an effect that I personally like. Some people don't. It's again a stylistic choice and personal preference. But what I would advise you not to do is if you want to draw a straight line, just draw a straight line, but don't do this, where you just repeat it so many times until you get it straight and then you erase parts of it and then you repeat it again, because it just doesn't look very nice. Another little tip that I want to give you is if you decide to make these big continuous lines, I advise you to occasionally lift up your pencil, because if you make a huge line and then you mess up at the very end, you either have to erase it, but sometimes it will just not look very good if you try to continue it. So try to lift up your pencil occasionally so that you have the luxury to hit undo and then continue without losing all of this progress that you made. Sometimes I like to add some values to my inked drawings in order to separate the volumes a little bit more. So in this case I'm going to shade the hair a little bit using a very textured watercolor-like brush from Max Uliczny's Retro Max Pack. So it's called the Gouache Natural Wash. Let me show you a little effect that I like to apply to my line work sometimes. I'm going to select all of my layers and group them, and then I'm going to duplicate that group. So I have 2 copies of it. I'm only selecting the line work, not the shading. This is the shading and I don't include it in the group. So I will collapse one of the groups. It doesn't matter which one because they're the same. And then I will go to Gaussian blur and apply about 2 or 3%. It really depends on the canvas size here. And then I will lower its opacity. So this is without the effect and this is with it. So it kind of softens the line, but at the same time, because you have the original line work, you still have that texture of it. And this is what it looks like with the shading. You can play around with the opacity of this blurred line work. I like to keep it at about 40 or 50%, but it really depends on the piece too. So now that we are done inking our character, let's quickly go over all the different ways that you can add weight to your line and how you can vary its thickness. The first thing are bones, edges, and corners. You can make your line thicker at those areas and keep it thinner at softer, fleshier parts of your character. The second thing are overlapping lines and volumes. So wherever you have one object that is in front of another object, the line of the one in front of the other one, it will be thicker. So the one that is closer to the camera will have thicker outlines, is what I'm trying to say. The next thing is weight. It's a really good idea to use thicker outlines if you want to show that something is weighing down. So usually the bottom parts of objects will have thicker outlines than the top ones, because this really helps to show that gravity is pulling them down. Use your light to indicate where the light is coming from. This is more valid for background design, but it can also be applied in character design sometimes. So whenever you have objects that are closer to the camera, they will have thicker outlines, and if you have objects that are going away from the camera and they are further, they will have thinner outlines because you have atmosphere that is making these objects lighter in value. Here is a very simple, but I think a pretty accurate example of that. You have this building that is closer to us, so its outline is a little bit thicker, but then you have this other building that is going further in space, so its outlines are a little bit thinner. And then if you add another building in the background too, it will be with even thinner outlines. The perspective is kind of wrong, but we're not discussing that here. Whenever you have contact between two objects, if they are pushing towards one another, try to make the line between them a little bit thinner, because this will indicate that there is force there and they are really, coming towards one another. If you make the line thick between them, you will kind of lose that effect. This is more of a stylistic choice, but if you want to define the silhouette of your character a little bit better, you can make the very outlines of your character a little bit thicker than what's inside. This is not really about line weight, but I advise you to use your line to show patterns and fabric materials, because it will really make your drawings a little bit more interesting. So let me share with you some very simple exercises that you can do if you want to get better at line work. Digital inking is a little bit harder than inking on paper because you have to be a little bit more precise, because the tablet is kind of detecting every single tiny movement that you make, which is not the same on paper. So you kind of have to have a very stable hand. And in order to achieve that, you have to do some exercises for it. Now, those might not be the most exciting exercises, but I think it's very helpful to do them at least for 5 minutes every day, or every other day even. One of the exercises is to simply draw circles, and I know that sounds very boring. It kind of is, but it's very important because it helps you to learn how to connect two dots, and you also have to try and draw actual circles and not ovals. So I am not the best at this exercise, and I also need to practice more, but I think it's a really good starting point. Even if you do 1 page a week, it's still better than nothing. The second exercise is to connect two dots, which is again very simple, but it's surprisingly difficult sometimes. Try to do it in one fast motion, not like this. This is really helpful for line control. And what I think is also very important is that you try to draw the lines in different directions, because we all have one certain direction and angle at which it's easiest to draw. But I think it's important that you can learn all the different angles. For example, I find it difficult to draw lines going this way, and I think that's true for most people. So I need to practice that particular thing a little bit more. And this is also the reason why I flip my canvas sometimes, because it's easier to draw something when it's on the left than when it's on the right, if that makes sense. So just try to make a page of these as well. Because if you have to draw something on paper sometimes, you won't have the luxury to flip your page and then do it. And you will be forced to kind of just draw it at the angle at which it is. So those are the two simple exercises that I have for you. The third thing that I would advise you to do is study your favorite artists. And I think this is a very tricky advice because I have given it in the past and I think people kind of misunderstand it and they start thinking that they should just start drawing in someone else's style until they find their own. This is not exactly what I mean when I give that advice, but in this particular case, what I mean is just find an ink drawing that you really like, make a study of it, and try to really think about what you're drawing and analyze the decisions that the artist made. And of course, if you decide to post your study, ask for permission first and also tag the artist. I think these are all of my line work advices that I have for you. I really hope this video was helpful and that you learned something new. And if you decide to apply the tips that I have, make sure to upload your drawings on our Discord channel because it's a really happy place. And you can also ask for feedback there or meet some new artists. Thank you so much for watching, guys, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!